It was just another quiet evening for William Carter. He sat alone on his worn-out porch, a small wooden chair creaking beneath him as he sipped his tea. The sun was slowly sinking behind the trees, painting the sky with soft orange and pink hues. The gentle breeze brushed through the leaves, and the world around him seemed to slow down. Everything was calm. Everything was peaceful. But to anyone who looked closely, William Carter wasn't just an ordinary old man. He wasn't like the others who lived quietly, blending into the background. William had always kept to himself, hiding away from the hustle and bustle of the world. His neighbors, the people who passed by his house every day, saw only the surface. To them, he was just a man of old age, with no more purpose than to sit in his chair and watch the world go by. They would never have guessed that behind those tired eyes, behind his soft smile, William carried a secret. A secret so big, so important, that if it ever came to light, it would shatter everything that anyone thought they knew about him. It would change the way the world saw him, and it would change the way the world saw everything. For years, William had kept his secret hidden. He had learned how to live with it, how to keep it locked away deep inside, hidden from the eyes of the world. No one knew the truth. Not his neighbors, not his friends, and certainly not the people who walked by his house every day, giving him only a passing glance. But tonight, everything was about to change. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves, and William took another sip of his tea, lost in thought. He had spent many years sitting here, watching the world pass him by. The years had been kind to him in some ways, but harsh in others. His hair had turned silver, his back had bent a little more each year, and his hands shook ever so slightly when he held a cup. But his mind remained sharp, his eyes still saw everything around him with clear vision. And that mind, that sharpness, had carried a burden, one that he had never shared with anyone. As the sun sank lower, a shadow fell across his porch. William glanced up, his eyes narrowing just slightly. There was something about the way the shadow lingered in the doorway that caught his attention. It wasn't the shadow of a passerby, someone on their way to somewhere else. No, this was different. It was the shadow of someone who had come for a reason. William set his tea down on the small wooden table beside him, his hand steady despite the passing years. His heart gave a small, unbidden thump in his chest, but he didn't show it. He had learned how to keep his emotions locked away, just as he had kept his secret. The door to his house creaked open, and a figure stepped out from the shadows. The figure was tall, with broad shoulders and a purposeful stride. William didn't need to ask who it was. He already knew. There was no mistaking that walk, that confidence in every step. "Evening, Father," the man said, his voice deep and calm. William Carter looked up at his son, Jonathan, who had just stepped onto the porch. The man who was once just a child in his arms, now a grown man with power in his eyes. Jonathan stood there for a moment, his gaze steady, his face unreadable. "Evening," William replied quietly, his voice steady but with a hint of something else, something that only Jonathan would understand. Jonathan had always known that his father was different. As a child, he had been told that his father had been a simple man, a hard-working man, someone who valued family and peace. William Carter had always appeared to be just like any other father, kind, quiet, and humble. But Jonathan had always sensed there was more to his father's story. There was something hidden beneath the surface, something that had never been shared, something that William had always kept to himself. "How's the day been?" Jonathan asked, sitting down beside him on the porch. His eyes flicked to the cup of tea William had been holding, but he didn't say anything about it. The two of them sat in silence for a moment, the cool evening air settling around them. "It's been a day like any other," William said. He paused, taking in the scene around him, the quiet of the evening, the stillness that filled the air. "But you're here. I wasn't expecting you tonight." Jonathan's lips twitched, a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. I thought I should come. It's been too long, Father. And there's something we need to talk about. William's heart skipped a beat. He had known this moment was coming, but he had prayed that it would never happen. But it was here, now. The moment he had been dreading for so long had finally arrived. Jonathan leaned forward, his voice dropping lower, the tone serious. I need you to tell me everything, Father. I need to know the truth. All of it. William didn't speak right away. He wasn't sure what to say, where to begin. The truth had been buried for so long that he wasn't sure it could be pulled out without destroying everything. But now, with his son standing here, with those words hanging in the air, he knew that there was no more running. No more hiding. I've spent my whole life hiding from it, William said softly. From the truth. From who I really am. Jonathan's expression softened slightly, though he said nothing. He understood. He had always known that there was something his father was keeping from him, something important. But he hadn't known the full extent of it. And now, he was about to. William stood slowly, his old bones creaking as he moved. He turned and walked into the house, Jonathan following silently behind him. The room inside was simple, the furniture old but well kept. A few photographs lined the walls, pictures of a life long past. William moved to a small wooden chest at the far side of the room, his hands steady despite his age. He opened the chest slowly, the hinges creaking as he lifted the lid. Inside were old papers, letters, and photographs, items that seemed insignificant to anyone else but held deep meaning for William. He pulled out a small, worn leather notebook, its pages yellowed with time. This was the key to the secret he had kept for so long. He turned to Jonathan, his eyes locking with his son's. You're about to learn a truth, Jonathan. A truth that will change everything. And once you know it, there will be no going back. Jonathan nodded, his face serious, his eyes filled with determination. I'm ready, Father. William opened the notebook, the pages crackling as he flipped through them. The ink had faded in places, but the words were still clear enough to read. He began to speak, his voice low but steady, as he began to tell the story of who he truly was, the secret he had carried for so long. And as he spoke, the quiet evening began to shift. The peaceful world around them seemed to tremble, as if it knew that everything was about to change. William Carter paused for a moment, taking a deep breath before continuing. His hands trembled ever so slightly, though he didn't allow his son to see it. He had spent so many years hiding from this moment, and now that it had arrived, he found himself struggling to find the words. But Jonathan was patient. His son stood there, silently waiting, his eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made William feel both proud and afraid. He could tell that Jonathan had always suspected there was more to the story, but his truth was far beyond anything Jonathan could have imagined. The notebook in his hands, now worn with age, seemed almost heavy, as if it were a burden he had carried alone for far too long. I've kept this secret for so long, William said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. But now, it seems, the time has come. The truth must come out. Jonathan nodded again, his face unreadable. Whatever it is, Father, I need to know. I need to understand who you really are. William exhaled deeply and slowly flipped open the leather-bound notebook. The pages were filled with his handwriting, neat, but hurried at times, as if written during moments of great stress. He read through a few lines, his eyes scanning the words. Each sentence was a memory, a fragment of his past that he had locked away. And now, it was all about to be laid bare before his son. He cleared his throat. It's not an easy story to tell, Jonathan. But you deserve to hear it. Jonathan stepped closer, his expression softening. Take your time, Father. I'm not going anywhere. William nodded, grateful for his son's patience. He could feel the weight of the years pressing down on him as he began to speak. It was a tale that spanned decades, one that began long before Jonathan was born. Long before William had become the quiet, humble man sitting on his porch each evening. "It all started when I was your age," William began, his voice trembling slightly with the memory. "I was young, too young, perhaps to fully understand the world. I was ambitious, though. Too ambitious, and that ambition led me down a path that I could never have predicted." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Back then, I wasn't the man you know me as. I wasn't just a simple carpenter, living in a small town, raising a family. No, I was involved in something far bigger. A secret. A dangerous secret." Jonathan's brow furrowed. "What do you mean, a secret?" William closed his eyes for a moment, as if summoning the courage to continue. "There was a time when I was part of something that few people knew existed. It was a group, a network, really, of powerful people who worked behind the scenes. They controlled things that most people couldn't even imagine. Governments, businesses, military operations, you name it. They pulled the strings, orchestrated events from the shadows." Jonathan's expression shifted. "You were part of some kind of secret organization?" William nodded grimly. "Yes. And I was deeply involved. At the time, I thought it was for the greater good. I thought I was helping to protect the country, to keep it safe from threats that no one else could see. But as time went on, I began to realize that the organization's goals were not as noble as I had believed. The more I learned, the more I saw how corrupt it was, how dangerous it was." Jonathan's eyes widened. "So what happened? Why didn't you tell anyone? Why did you leave?" William took a deep breath. "Because, Jonathan, leaving wasn't an option. Not for me. Once you're in, it's not easy to get out. You can't just walk away from that kind of power. I had to make a choice. A hard choice." He looked at his son, his eyes filled with both regret and resolution. "I chose to disappear. I cut ties with everyone. I walked away from that life and faked my own death." Jonathan blinked in surprise. "You faked your death?" William nodded slowly. "I knew the only way to escape them was to erase myself completely. To become someone else. I left behind everything, my friends, my colleagues, my past. I had to start over, from scratch, with no one knowing who I really was." Jonathan's face was pale now. "But why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell anyone?" William closed the notebook and looked at his son, his gaze steady. "I couldn't, Jonathan. It was too dangerous. I had to protect you. If they knew about you, if they knew you were my son, they would have used you against me. And I couldn't let that happen." Jonathan stood still for a moment, taking in the weight of his father's words. "So everything you've told me about your life was a lie?" William shook his head gently. "No, not everything. I didn't lie about who I was, only about who I was running from. I wanted you to have a normal life. To grow up without the burden of knowing what I had done. But what if they're still out there? What if they come after us now?" William's heart tightened. He had feared this moment, feared the possibility that Jonathan would find out the truth and that it would bring danger back into their lives. He had hoped, for so long, that they could remain hidden, safe from the shadows of the past. "I don't know," he said quietly. "But I've spent my whole life protecting you. And I will continue to do so, no matter what it takes." The room was silent for a long time. The air between them felt heavy, thick with the gravity of what had just been revealed. William could see the conflict in his son's eyes, the confusion, the fear. But there was also something else, something that made him proud. It was the same resolve, the same strength that William had always seen in Jonathan. The same strength he had tried so hard to protect. "I know this is a lot to take in," William said, his voice soft. But you need to understand that I didn't do this to hurt you. I did it to keep you safe. And now that you know the truth, we can't go back. We have to face whatever comes next, together. Jonathan swallowed hard, then nodded. I don't know what to say, Father. This is a lot. But I'll stand by you. Whatever happens, we're in this together. William's heart swelled with pride. Thank you, Jonathan. You don't know how much that means to me. The two of them stood there for a long while, not saying anything, but knowing that everything had changed. The quiet evening outside had become something else entirely. The secret that William had hidden for so long was now out in the open. There was no going back. And as the shadows stretched across the room, they both knew that their lives would never be the same again. The evening had been quiet, too quiet. The cool breeze continued to blow, rustling the trees around William's house, making the leaves dance in the dimming light. But that stillness shattered when a loud, rumbling engine echoed down the gravel driveway. William, sitting on his porch, felt a small knot tighten in his stomach. His peace was being disturbed again. But it wasn't just the noise, there was something else in the air, something that made his skin prickle. He had lived in this small town for many years, but in all that time, no one had ever dared to cause him trouble. Yet, there were always a few people who thought they could push him around. And tonight, it seemed, one of those people had come to his doorstep. Officer Jack Callahan. William had seen him before most people in town had. Callahan was known for his arrogance. He was young, strong, and full of himself. The kind of man who wore his uniform like a badge of superiority. And to people like William, people who had lived through enough to know better, Callahan's confidence wasn't just annoying, it was dangerous. William had often watched from his porch as the officer drove through the neighborhood, his eyes scanning the area, looking down on everyone. People in the town had learned to avoid Callahan, knowing that his behavior was unpredictable. But for William, it was more than just his reputation. It was the way Callahan looked at him, as if he were nothing more than an old man waiting to die. William had never had a problem with the officer, at least not until now. But something about tonight felt different. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, a feeling that William couldn't shake. He stood slowly from his chair, his old bones creaking as he rose to his feet. His mind was sharp, but his body had started to betray him with age. He hadn't been the strong man he once was, but that didn't mean he was defenseless. No one was. As Callahan's patrol car stopped in front of William's driveway, dust rose in the air, swirling around the wheels of the vehicle. The officer's boots thudded against the gravel as he got out of the car. His eyes immediately locked onto William, a sneer curling on his lips. It was the same look he always gave William, the same one that made him feel small. But this time, William wasn't going to let it slide. The officer approached, his footsteps heavy and deliberate, echoing in the evening stillness. Callahan didn't waste time with pleasantries. He just stopped in front of William, hands on his hips, looking down at him as if he were an inconvenience. "Evening, old man," Callahan said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Just a quick check. Hand over your ID. I need to make sure you're still breathing, don't want any surprises around here, you know." William didn't move, his eyes meeting Callahan's with quiet steadiness. He could feel his pulse quicken, but he kept his voice calm. "I'm not breaking any laws. What's the reason for this visit?" Callahan's sneer deepened. "What's the reason? I'm a cop, and that's all the reason I need. Now hand over your ID, or I'll start asking more questions." "You wouldn't want that, would you?" The arrogance in Callahan's voice made William's blood boil, but he kept his temper in check. The officer's taunts were nothing new, but tonight, something about it felt different. Maybe it was the way Callahan was standing there, the way he looked at William as though he didn't even matter, as if he could do whatever he wanted. Maybe it was the fact that Callahan thought he could push around anyone, especially an old man like William. "I haven't done anything wrong, officer," William said, his voice firm but calm. "You have no reason to ask for my identification." Callahan let out a sharp laugh, his tone mocking. "What are you gonna do, old man? Call the cops? You are the cops, aren't you?" He stepped closer, his face now inches from William's. "You don't have anyone to turn to. It's just you and me out here." William's heart beat faster now. He could feel the anger bubbling up inside him, but he refused to let it show. He had learned long ago that letting others see your anger was a weakness. Instead, he kept his face calm, even as Callahan's breath brushed against his cheek. There was a subtle shift in the air, a crackle of tension that neither of them could ignore. Callahan took another step forward, towering over William, his fists clenched. "You're nothing but an old man. You've got nothing left to fight for, do you? So what's the point in resisting me?" William didn't flinch. The officer's words were cruel, but they weren't new. He had been called worse in his life. He had faced far worse than this. But the officer didn't understand. He didn't know what William had endured, the battles he had fought, the lives he had lived. To Callahan, William was just a frail old man with no fight left in him. But William had learned to fight in different ways. He wasn't just going to back down. For a moment, everything was still. The only sound was the distant rustling of the leaves in the trees, as though the world itself was waiting for something to happen. Then, William spoke, his voice low and steady. "You can mock me all you want, officer, but I won't let you bully me. You can't intimidate me. And I'm not giving you my ID." Callahan's face twisted in rage. "You think you can refuse me?" His voice was thick with anger now, and he took a step back, reaching for his belt. "I'll teach you some respect, old man." William saw the officer's hand reach for something, a weapon, perhaps. His heart skipped a beat, but he didn't show it. His eyes didn't leave Callahan's face. This wasn't just about an ID anymore. It was about something deeper, something personal. "Stay where you are," William said sharply, his voice firm. "Don't take another step." For a moment, Callahan hesitated, the officer's eyes narrowing as he sized up the old man standing before him. William stood tall, his posture straight despite his age, the strength of his resolve visible in the way he held himself. There was something in his gaze, a glimmer of defiance, that made Callahan pause. But then, in a flash of rage, Callahan swung at William, his fist coming down hard toward the elderly man's face. William's heart raced as he instinctively stepped back, but the blow was too fast. It connected with his jaw, a brutal hit that sent pain coursing through his body. The force of it made him stumble back, but he didn't fall. He didn't go down. Callahan's eyes gleamed with satisfaction, but the moment was fleeting. William, despite his age and the years that had worn down his body, wasn't going to be a victim tonight. The punch had triggered something deep inside him, something that had been buried for years. The years of silence, of restraint, all came rushing back. William's hand shot up, his grip firm and steady as he grabbed the officer's wrist. Callahan, taken aback, tried to pull away, but William held on tight. He wasn't just going to let this go. "Don't underestimate me," William muttered, his voice low but filled with power. "You've made a mistake tonight, officer." Callahan's face twisted with anger as he tried to break free. But the more he struggled, the tighter William's grip became. The officer's arrogance was no longer enough to protect him. He wasn't just facing an old man anymore. He was facing someone who had lived through things that Callahan couldn't even imagine. The seconds felt like minutes. Each tick of the clock on the wall inside William's house seemed louder, as if the world itself was waiting to see how this moment would unfold. Outside, Officer Callahan was growing more and more frustrated. His hands clenched into fists, his knuckles turning white with rage. He couldn't stand how William refused to show fear. The old man, standing there on his porch, was a reminder that not everyone could be pushed around, no matter how young or strong they were. Callahan was used to seeing people crumble under his presence. He had dealt with troublemakers before, but they all had one thing in common: they had all backed down when faced with his authority. He had never met anyone like William. The old man didn't flinch. He didn't cower. He just stood there, calm and steady, watching him with eyes that seemed to see through him, almost as if he knew something Callahan didn't. "You think I won't hurt you?" Callahan growled, his voice thick with contempt. "I've dealt with guys like you before. You're nothing. Just an old, washed-up man." His words were cruel, meant to provoke, but they had no effect on William. The officer's arrogance only made William's resolve stronger. He had lived through much worse than this, much worse than Callahan's empty threats. But the officer wasn't done. Callahan's anger was growing by the second. He felt humiliated by how the old man was standing his ground. The young officer couldn't allow that. Not in front of him. Not in front of anyone. He had to show William who was in control. Before William could say another word, Callahan's fist shot out, fast and furious. The officer had placed steel knuckles over his fingers. The punch came out of nowhere, slamming into William's face with a sickening crack. The pain exploded through William's jaw, but he didn't fall. His body staggered back a step, his hands gripping the porch railing, but he didn't fall. He refused to fall. For a moment, everything was still. William's breath came in short, sharp gasps, pain flashing through his body, but he was still standing. Callahan stood there for a second, shocked. He had expected the old man to drop to the ground, to crumple beneath the force of his blow. But William didn't give him that satisfaction. Instead, he lifted his head, his eyes blazing with a fire that Callahan hadn't expected. The officer's mouth hung open in disbelief. "You should have fallen," Callahan muttered, his voice shaky. "You should have dropped like every other man who's ever dared to stand in my way." But William didn't speak. His hands gripped the railing tighter, as if holding on to the last bit of strength he had. The pain was real, burning through him, but he wasn't going to give Callahan the satisfaction of seeing him break. Callahan took a step forward, his face twisted in fury. "You're a stubborn old fool," he spat. "I'll make you pay for this." But William didn't respond. He was thinking, calculating, planning. He had spent years living a quiet life, hiding away from the world, but he hadn't forgotten what he was capable of. The world thought he was just a frail old man, someone who couldn't possibly stand up to someone like Callahan. But they were wrong. Callahan swung again, this time with both fists, his steel knuckles glinting in the fading light. The officer's anger was clear, his rage fueling every movement. But this time, William was ready. He stepped to the side just in time, his old reflexes sharp despite the years that had passed. Callahan's fists missed him by inches, and the officer stumbled forward, throwing himself off balance. The old man's body might have been frail, but his mind was sharp. William seized the opportunity, using all his remaining strength to grab Callahan by the shoulder and twist. In one smooth motion, he sent the officer crashing to the ground. Callahan hit the gravel hard, his face contorting with surprise and pain. For a moment, the officer just lay there, gasping for breath. William stood over him, panting, sweat dripping down his forehead. The pain in his jaw was still intense, but he had a job to do. "Get up," William said quietly. "You wanted to teach me respect? Well, here's your lesson." Callahan's face twisted in anger as he pushed himself up, shaking his head in disbelief. He had underestimated the old man, and now he was paying for it. His pride was wounded, but his anger was even more so. He wasn't done. Not yet. But before he could get back on his feet, a noise broke through the tension. A phone, ringing in the distance. It wasn't loud, but it was there. A phone ringing, somewhere far away, in an office, in a room where decisions were made. The sound of it was almost out of place in this quiet confrontation between an officer and an elderly man. But it was the beginning of something much bigger than either of them could imagine. As the phone rang, somewhere in a distant city, a man in a dark suit picked up the receiver. His voice, deep and commanding, spoke calmly into the phone. He was a man who rarely had his authority questioned, a man whose decisions shaped the lives of many. His name was known to a select few, but his influence stretched far beyond the walls of his office. Yes. The man's voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it. A hint of something dangerous in his tone. "Sir, we've just received an unexpected report. There's been an incident," came the voice on the other end of the line. "It's about a man named William Carter. He's being attacked by Officer Callahan. The situation seems complicated." The man's eyes narrowed. He hadn't heard that name in years. William Carter. The man who had vanished from the world's view long ago, the man who had been left behind in the shadows. But now, something had happened. Something had stirred. "I see," the man said, his voice cold. "Is everything under control?" The voice on the other end hesitated. "We're not sure yet. Callahan is a trained officer, and he's not the kind of man who backs down easily. But Carter, he's different. He's not the man we thought he was." The man in the suit leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepling as he thought. This was more than just an old man being attacked. This was something else. Something important. He needed to know more. "Keep me updated," the man said, his voice now firm. "And make sure Callahan doesn't make any more mistakes." He hung up the phone, his mind already racing. There were connections here, connections he hadn't even begun to understand. But he would. He would find out who William Carter really was. Back on the porch, the fight between William and Callahan continued. The officer, now more enraged than ever, charged at the elderly man again. But William, now fully awake to the danger, was ready. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, and for the first time in years, he felt alive. This was no longer just a fight for survival, it was a fight for something much bigger than either of them realized. Callahan was fast, but William was faster. Each punch from the officer missed its target, and with each miss, Callahan's anger grew. He couldn't understand it. He was trained to take down anyone who posed a threat. But this old man, he was different. William's body may have been frail, but his spirit was unbreakable. He wasn't going to let this man, this arrogant officer, destroy him. Not today. Not when so much was at stake. The air was thick with tension, every breath sharp and filled with a sense of danger. The fight had been going on for a while, and Officer Callahan's anger was boiling over. Sweat dripped from his forehead, and his fists were clenched tightly. He had no idea that his actions tonight would lead to something he could never have imagined. William stood there, his face bruised from the earlier blow. His body was tired, and pain throbbed through his bones, but he still held his ground. He refused to fall. His hands shook slightly, but his eyes were steady, his gaze calm, almost resigned. He had been in situations much worse than this. And even though his age was against him, William was not going to let this man break him. He had lived too long to let some angry, reckless officer take him down. Officer Callahan was on the edge. He raised his fist again, ready to strike another blow. His eyes were filled with rage, and his breath came out in harsh, uneven gasps. He wasn't thinking clearly anymore. All he could see was the old man in front of him, the one who had dared to challenge him. Callahan wasn't used to being ignored, and he wasn't used to being disrespected. The old man had made a mistake, and Callahan was going to make him pay for it. As the officer's fist came down, there was a sudden loud noise, a car screeching to a halt just a few feet away. Both men turned their heads, momentarily distracted by the sound. William's eyes barely flickered to the car, his body too focused on the fight to register the significance of the moment. But Callahan's focus wavered. He looked toward the car, his eyes narrowing in confusion. The door to the car swung open, and a figure stepped out. The person who emerged had a presence that couldn't be ignored. The figure was tall, dressed in a dark suit that seemed to radiate authority. His movements were confident and purposeful, and there was a calm, powerful air about him that immediately drew the attention of everyone nearby. "Jack!" The man called out, his voice clear and commanding, cutting through the air like a blade. The words were not a request. They were a command. "Stop. Now." Officer Callahan froze. His fist was still raised, but he didn't bring it down. He was startled, confused, unsure of what was happening. His eyes scanned the man who had just appeared, trying to make sense of this new development. Who was this person? Why had he called him by name? What was going on? William, still holding his ground, turned his head slowly. He had heard the voice too, and something about it felt different, familiar, almost. But in his state of exhaustion, it was hard to connect the dots. He could only focus on the figure in front of him, who was now walking towards the confrontation. The man who had arrived did not hesitate. He was calm but authoritative, and his gaze was fixed firmly on Officer Callahan. It was clear that he wasn't someone Callahan could easily dismiss. Callahan, still trying to process the situation, blinked. His confusion grew as he looked from the stranger to William. That was when something unexpected happened. His face went pale. His jaw tightened in shock, and his eyes widened as if he had just seen something he hadn't prepared for. The stranger stopped in front of Callahan, standing tall with an air of authority that was impossible to ignore. He spoke again, his voice smooth and firm. "Jack," he said slowly, his tone now colder. "You've made a very big mistake." Callahan swallowed hard, trying to keep his composure. But deep down, he knew he had messed up. He just didn't know how badly. His heart pounded in his chest, and the reality of the situation began to sink in. Then the stranger spoke the words that made everything click for Callahan, words that made him wish he had never raised his fist at William Carter. "Do you know who you're messing with?" the man asked, his voice quiet but carrying an undeniable weight. "This man," he pointed to William, "is my father." The words hung in the air for a moment, heavy with meaning. Callahan blinked. His brain struggled to process the information. William's father? Who was this man? And why did it feel like this was far bigger than anything he could have imagined? It was only then that the full weight of the situation hit Callahan. The man standing in front of him wasn't just anyone. He was Jonathan Carter, the son of the elderly man he had been attacking. Jonathan Carter wasn't just some businessman or politician. No, he was the President of the United States. Callahan's heart skipped a beat. The President's son? He had just attacked the father of the most powerful man in the country, and he hadn't even realized it. All this time, he had been bullying and mocking William, treating him like a helpless old man. But he had been wrong, so very wrong. The pieces clicked together in Callahan's mind. The quiet, unassuming old man he had been tormenting for hours wasn't just anyone. He wasn't just an old man who had lived in the shadows. No, William Carter was the father of Jonathan Carter, the most powerful person in the entire country. And Officer Callahan had just crossed a line that no one should have ever crossed. Jonathan Carter's expression was unreadable, his eyes cold and unblinking as he took in the scene. He didn't need to say much more. His presence alone was enough to send a message. Callahan's face turned red with embarrassment, the realization of what he had done crashing down on him. He opened his mouth, trying to find the right words, but no words came out. His throat was dry, and he couldn't think straight. He had been a fool, blinded by his own arrogance. He had attacked the wrong man, and now he was standing in front of the president's son, trying to figure out how to explain himself. Jonathan didn't give him the chance to stammer out an apology. His voice was sharp as he turned to one of the other officers who had been following him. "Get him out of here. Now." The officers moved quickly, seizing Callahan and pulling him away from William's porch. Callahan's protests were drowned out by the sound of his own panic, his mind still trying to process the shocking truth. Jonathan turned to William, his expression softening. "Dad," he said quietly, his voice filled with concern. "Are you okay?" William, despite the pain still radiating from his bruised face, managed to give his son a small smile. He was tired, so very tired, but now, with Jonathan standing before him, he felt a strange sense of relief. The years of hiding, of being overlooked and forgotten, had led to this moment. His son, the president, had come to his defense. And now, the world would know the truth. "I'm fine, Jonathan," William said, his voice steady. "Just a little bruised." Jonathan nodded, his jaw clenched tightly as he looked down at Officer Callahan, now being escorted away. He couldn't believe what had just happened. This had been a wake-up call, one that would send ripples far beyond this small town. "Don't worry, Dad," Jonathan said softly. "We'll make sure this never happens again." And just like that, the quiet old man who had lived in the shadows for so long was no longer just an old man. He was the father of the President of the United States, and Officer Callahan had just learned a very hard lesson. The night was far from over, but the atmosphere had shifted. What started as a tense and violent encounter was now heading toward a resolution, one that no one had expected. The air felt heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. The sound of Jonathan's voice still lingered in the air, his commanding words echoing through the street. "Get him out of here," Jonathan had ordered, and within seconds, security officers appeared, quickly and efficiently taking control of the situation. They moved toward Officer Callahan, who was still trying to process what had just happened. The officer, now realizing the magnitude of his mistake, stood frozen for a moment, his face flushed with a mixture of panic and humiliation. Jonathan didn't wait for Callahan to gather his thoughts. With a single, cold glance, he directed the officers to escort the disgraced officer off the property. The moment had come. The power dynamics had shifted, and there was no turning back. "You'll answer for this," Jonathan said firmly, his voice unwavering as he spoke directly to Callahan. His words weren't just a warning. They were a promise. A promise that this injustice would not go unanswered. Callahan's knees buckled slightly as the officers moved to restrain him. He wanted to say something, to explain, but the words never came. All he could do was stare, his mouth agape, as he was led away from William's property. The crowd that had gathered in the distance stood in stunned silence. They had witnessed the power of Jonathan Carter, President of the United States, but what they had seen tonight was something different. They had seen the power of a son protecting his father. They had seen the true strength of family, and they had watched as one man's arrogance had crumbled in the face of that strength. The people who had been watching from a distance began to murmur to each other. Some were confused, some shocked, and others whispered about the magnitude of what had just unfolded. But one thing was clear, they had just witnessed an unforgettable moment. The sight of Officer Callahan, who had thought he could treat an elderly man with cruelty, now being escorted away in disgrace, was a powerful statement. It was a moment that would be talked about for years to come. Despite the chaos unfolding around him, William Carter remained composed. His face was bruised, his body battered from the brutal assault, but his spirit was unbroken. He stood there quietly, looking at his son, Jonathan, who was now dealing with the aftermath of the scene. William's heart was full of pride, not just for the fact that his son had stepped in to protect him, but also for the quiet strength that William himself had shown throughout the ordeal. Jonathan walked over to his father, who had been standing there with an air of calm, as if nothing had happened. William's eyes, though tired and weary from the night's events, met Jonathan's with a sense of understanding. There were no words necessary between them. Jonathan simply nodded, acknowledging his father's strength. The quiet nod was all it took to show that, despite the chaos, there was a deep bond between them, one that would always stand strong, no matter the circumstances. As the security officers drove away with Callahan, the street slowly began to clear. The crowd dispersed, but the murmurs and whispers did not fade. People couldn't stop talking about the events of the evening, their minds racing with the unexpected turn of events. The world had just witnessed something incredible, the story of an elderly man who had been underestimated, ignored, and mistreated, only to reveal that he was more than anyone had ever known. And the man who had dared to treat him with such cruelty would now face the consequences. Jonathan stood still, his posture straight and authoritative, his gaze unwavering. The events of the night were far from over, and there was still much to be done. The word would spread quickly. People needed to understand that the president's family, the man who held the power to change the country, would not stand idly by while someone was wronged. The story would soon become national news, spreading across the media and through every corner of the country. It wasn't just a story about an officer who made a mistake, it was a story about justice, about family, and about power that came not from titles or wealth, but from something far deeper. Jonathan's mind was already racing with the steps he needed to take next. He knew the press would be clamoring for answers, but he also knew that there was more to this than just a moment of power. The public would soon learn that William Carter was not just a forgotten old man in a quiet town, he was a symbol of resilience, of strength, and of the bonds that hold families together. And the officer who had dared to strike him would face not only legal consequences, but the full weight of a nation's scrutiny. The moment was heavy, but it wasn't just about punishment. Jonathan wasn't interested in making an example of Officer Callahan for the sake of it. He wanted justice. He wanted to show that no one, no matter their position or power, was above the law. Callahan had forgotten that, and now he would learn the hard way. The news spread quickly. The incident that had started as a small act of violence on a quiet street had now become a national story. The press was quick to report the details, and soon the entire country was talking about it. The headlines were everywhere: President's son protects his father from brutal officer, officer suspended after attacking elderly man, and a story of family, power, and justice. As the days passed, the events of that night only grew in importance. The world was watching as Jonathan Carter took swift action, making it clear that the law would not tolerate abuse of power. Callahan's suspension was just the beginning. The investigation into his actions was thorough and quick, and soon, the officer faced formal charges. His career, once built on arrogance and cruelty, was now crumbling. The man who had believed he could strike down an elderly man without consequences would now pay the price for his actions. And it wasn't just Callahan who would pay. The entire police department was forced to reckon with the way its officers treated citizens, especially the elderly. For William, the road ahead was long, but the quiet man who had endured so much was now able to stand tall. He knew his actions had sent a powerful message, but it wasn't about revenge or anger. It was about something much greater: justice. The night had unfolded in ways he never could have predicted, but he was proud of the way things had played out. The world now knew who he was, and more importantly, they knew what he stood for. Jonathan, for his part, remained by his father's side, doing everything in his power to ensure that justice would be served, not just for his father, but for anyone who had ever been wronged. He had seen firsthand the importance of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, and it was a lesson he would never forget. As the weeks passed, life slowly returned to normal, but the story of that night would never be forgotten. William Carter's name was now known across the country, not just as the father of the president, but as a symbol of resilience, strength, and quiet dignity. And Officer Callahan's name? It would forever be remembered as a reminder that even the most powerful people have to answer for their actions. Justice had been served. And in the end, it wasn't just about punishing a wrongdoer. It was about sending a message to the world: no one was above the law, and no one should ever underestimate the power of family, truth, and resilience. The world is quick to judge. It's easy to look at someone, especially if they are older, smaller, or different in some way, and assume they are weak. It's a mistake many of us make. We see the surface and think we know everything about that person. We think we can predict how they will act or what they are capable of. But often, we couldn't be more wrong. People like William Carter show us that strength doesn't always come from what we can see. It doesn't come from the muscles we show or the words we speak loudly. True strength comes from within. It's not about how strong you appear or how well you are dressed. It's about the heart, the will, and the resilience that lives deep inside you. And sometimes, the quietest, most humble people are the ones who hold the greatest power. It's easy to make assumptions about someone's worth. We all do it, in one way or another. We see someone who is quiet, old, or alone, and we think they don't have much to offer. We forget that everyone has a story, a hidden strength, or a power waiting to be unleashed. We forget that sometimes, the most unlikely people are the ones who will surprise us the most. That night, William Carter taught us something important: just because you're older, quieter, or less noticed, it doesn't mean you are weak. In fact, it could mean the opposite. People who have lived through life, who have weathered storms and seen hardships, often have the greatest wisdom. They know how to handle pain, how to stand tall in the face of adversity, and how to keep going even when the world tries to knock them down. The power of a person is not measured by their age, their job, or the title they hold. Power isn't always about being loud, strong, or outwardly impressive. It's about what you carry inside. It's about the quiet strength that guides you through difficult times. It's about the resilience to keep moving forward, no matter how hard life gets. William had lived quietly, away from the world's attention. He had hidden his true identity, not because he was ashamed, but because he knew that strength isn't about seeking attention. It's about standing firm in who you are. And while most people saw him as just an old man, they didn't know who he truly was. He wasn't just the father of the president, he was someone who had lived through hardship, who had learned the lessons that life had taught him. He had learned how to be strong, not because of what he could do with his hands, but because of the strength in his heart. This story reminds us of something we all too easily forget: sometimes, the biggest secrets aren't about hidden identities or special powers. The biggest secret is about who we are at our core, and the strength we carry within ourselves. No matter how much we try to hide it, the truth always comes to light. It may take time, but it will be revealed in the end. We live in a world where it's easy to forget that people are more than just what they appear to be. It's easy to assume that someone's appearance or their age means they are weak or fragile. But life isn't always about what meets the eye. True strength lies in how we handle the challenges we face, how we treat others, and how we rise up after we fall. Jonathan Carter understood this more than anyone. He knew that the strength of his father, William, wasn't something that could be measured by age or by looks. It was the kind of strength that comes from years of experience, from making it through the hardest of times. And when Jonathan stepped in that night, he wasn't just protecting his father, he was defending the very idea that true power comes from within. It's not just about the people in powerful positions. It's about all of us. We all have strength in us. Some of us may have to dig deeper to find it, but it's there. We all have the ability to stand strong, to keep going, even when things seem impossible. And when we rise up, when we find that inner strength, we can face anything. We can stand up to the hardest challenges, the greatest adversity, and the people who try to push us down. Sometimes, we don't even know how strong we are until we're put to the test. Sometimes, it takes a challenge to reveal the strength that we've always carried inside. And when that happens, the world takes notice. We become the person who shows others what true strength really means. Not through words or actions that are loud or flashy, but through the quiet, determined way we carry ourselves. No one could have predicted what would happen that night. But what followed was a powerful reminder that the most unassuming people can hold incredible power. William Carter was a living testament to this. He may have been older and quieter than most people, but his strength was undeniable. And when the time came for him to show it, he stood firm. He held his ground and showed the world what it meant to be truly strong. We all have the power to make a difference, to stand up for what's right, and to show the world that it's not about how we look, how old we are, or what we've done in the past. It's about who we are on the inside. The strength we have in our hearts. And the courage to show it when the world needs it most. In the end, the greatest power comes from within. The true strength of a person is not about their appearance or their position in life. It's about their heart, their spirit, and their ability to keep going, even when things seem impossible. And no matter how much we try to hide it, that power will always come to light. It will always find a way to show itself. And when it does, it's impossible to ignore. Sometimes, the greatest lessons come from the most unexpected places. And sometimes, the quietest people have the loudest voices when they choose to speak. The world may judge us by our outward appearances, but it's who we are inside that truly defines us. So, no matter how the world may see us, we must always remember that we are stronger than they know. And when the time comes, we can show them just how strong we really are. The secret of strength is not something that can be seen from the outside. It's not something that can be measured by age, by position, or by how much we own. True strength is in the heart, in the spirit, and in the resilience we carry with us every day. And that is a secret that will always shine through, no matter how deeply it's buried.